Welcome to the Economic Rockstar Podcast with your host, Frank Conway, connecting brilliant minds in economics and finance.
Hi, Frank Conway here, and if you're a returning listener, I'd like to welcome you back to the podcast. And if you've only recently discovered me, you might notice in previous episodes I've taken a break, almost 1 year from podcasting. And firstly, I'd like to apologise to all listeners of the Economic Rockstar podcast for what seemingly appears to be me turning my back on the podcast and on you. I honestly never had planned for this, and I had always intended to work hard and deliver great quality episodes to the best of my abilities with the most amazing, thought-provoking and inspiring economists to you every week. However, personal circumstances changed in my life and this impacted on the podcast. I felt that I couldn't commit 100% to the time that I had allocated to the podcast. In the meantime, I'd like to thank all of you who have contacted me on Facebook, Twitter and by email, inquiring about the podcast and wishing me well. I truly appreciate it, and it was really nice to have my listeners get in touch and show a desire and a hunger for more interviews. The realisation kicked in when I struggled to feel the natural enthusiasm that I previously had in the lead up to and during each interview process. I honestly felt that it wasn't fair to my guests and to you by not being fully present. The last interview that I recorded prior to this most recent one that I'm going to release today was early in 2017 with the distinguished economist and Nobel laureate Professor Vernon Smith. And ironically, I felt it was my best interview to date. I decided that I just wanted to know about the person rather than the discipline, and I felt that this approach uncovered great insights into Professor Smith's thinking and role as an economist. And perhaps it's a coincidence that I'm releasing the first episode in almost a year on the day of Professor Smith's birthday, January 1st. Happy 91st birthday, Vernon. I release my interview with Vernon next Thursday. If you're a fan of the podcast and would like to show your support in any way, please check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/Economic Rockstar, where you can sign up for any of the awards for as little as $1 a month, or you can simply follow me on the Economic Rockstar Facebook page or on Twitter, or simply recommend a show to a friend, especially if they have never had the opportunity to study economics or are even considering dipping their toe in the discipline. Any little support out there would be truly appreciated. And of course, you listening to this episode right now is very much appreciated. So to begin again, in this week's episode of the Economic Rockstar podcast, I speak to Professor Robin Hanson, Associate Professor of Economics at George Mason University. Professor Hanson has been on the podcast on two previous occasions, episodes 73 and 91, and has kindly joined me again for a hat-trick of episodes. We talk about his new book, The Elephant in the Brain, Hidden Motives in Everyday Life, co-authored with Kevin Simler, and available right now to buy in all good bookstores and of course online through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Book Depository and many more. The book has its official release today, January 1st. Also, you could check out Robin and Kevin's website, elephantintheroom.com, to explore the book in finer detail, as well as some great content such as interviews, reviews, and a TED Talk on the subject. You could also download or stream this 122nd episode of the Economic Rockstar podcast, as well as find all the links I just mentioned at economicrockstar.com/Robin Hanson 3. Enjoy this episode, and again, I really appreciate you listening. Hi, Frank Conway here, and you're listening to the Economic Rockstar podcast. I'm so honoured to have Professor Robin Hanson join me today. Hi, Robin, welcome to the show.
Hey there, it's great to be back.
I'm a bit rusty at the moment. It's been a while since I've had a podcast, to be honest. So, Robin Hanson is Associate Professor of Economics at George Mason University, and he's also Research Associate at Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute and Chief Scientist at Consensus Point. Robin, you've previously featured on two episodes, episode 91 and episode 73, and we spoke at the time on your book, The Age of M, and how brain emulations will double economic growth every month. And recently, you've now going to release a new book, co-authored and it's known as the elephant in the brain. And that's quite an interesting heading, given that it's usually we have a term, the elephant in the room. And I'd love to find out what this book is about, and firstly, what the aim of the book is about.
Well, the subtitle is more literal. It's called Hidden Motives in Everyday Life. So it's about the fact that we don't know why we do things a lot of the time. And in fact, we believe we know why we do them and we're wrong. So the elephant in the brain is the thing in our brain that we don't want to see, even though it's kind of obvious, just like the elephant in the room is the topic we don't want to see because it's kind of obvious. And so the topic in the brain we don't want to see is our selfish motives. That is, we often attribute to our behavior to relatively pro-social motives that we can admire and be proud of, and more often our motives are more selfish than we admit.
When you mentioned about being selfish or self-interested, immediately I recall Adam Smith's discussion in the Theory of Moral Sentiments on self-interest behavior. Is this something that has motivated you to delve into that type of classical thinking, into current thinking on behavioral economics?
Well, of course, as an economist, I've kept track of behavioral economics, and I'm aware of a lot of it, but of course, there's far more that I'm unaware of, I'm sure. A lot of behavioral economics comes across as saying, our ordinary theories are wrong, and usually in detail, it's a little off, but there's no particular pattern in where it's off. So instead of being accurate, we might be overconfident or underconfident, but there's no particular way to predict when we're overconfident or underconfident, and there's no grand explanation. It's just a lot of detail you have to figure out in each situation. Are we overconfident or underconfident? Our book is more about a grand systematic explanation. So it's saying the thing you thought before was wrong, and here's a simple, broad explanation to help you predict which way it's wrong and why.
Do we have ways of helping us predict why things might be wrong or not? Or is this just human behavior and it's just evolution, and we just have to accept that any way of predicting whether we're right or wrong is to do with how other people might pass judgment on us? Or is just something that we have to self-reflect and make our own judgment on it?
I don't think anybody's going to accuse our theory of being overly complicated. We have a relatively straightforward, relatively simple theory. You might doubt it and not believe it, but I don't think it's that hard to understand or comprehend. We're saying that in a wide range of areas, when people say why they do something like go to school, the typical answer they might give, such as to learn the material, is a explanation that's relatively easy to embrace and respect as the person doing it. It seems like it's good for society. And then if you look at other explanations, there aren't that many of them that you might consider, and some of them are straightforward but selfish, like showing off. You might be going to school to show off how smart and conscientious and conformist you are. And that explanation, if you accept it, is relatively straightforward to figure out what it predicts. And then the task is just to take this simple theory of what the usual story is and the relatively simple theory of the alternative story, and then compare them to the details of the behavior to figure out which one fits those details better.
You mentioned in a blurb on the website for The Elephant in the Brain that we may be self-interested schemers, but we benefit by pretending otherwise. And the less we know about our ugly motives, the better. In what way would that be better for us to be ignorant of our ugly motives as such?
So humans are unique compared to other animals in a number of ways. And one of the important ways is that we have social norms. Chimpanzees might, be careful and strategic in interacting with each other, but they'll mostly be doing it for selfish reasons or for their allies' reasons. Whereas for a human group, there'll be some rules about what you're supposed to do and not supposed to do. And if you're found violating a rule, then some people can see it and then tell other people about it using language. And then they can talk about what to do about it, including various escalation of punishment on you. And then they have weapons to enforce that. And that means norms actually work among humans. There are rules that you'll be punished for violating. And many of these rules and norms are expressed in terms of motives. So if I accidentally hit you, that's not a big deal. If I hit you on purpose, that is a big deal. And so we're constantly looking out to explain other people's motives, to ask what's the motive behind the behavior. And we're constantly tracking our own behavior and trying to come up with a story of our own behavior that makes it sound to be consistent with benign or good motives. And so the reason we might want to know our real motives is that gets in the way of the story we want to tell, that we had good motives for each particular thing we did.
If we want to find out what these kind of darker motives were, what would the purpose of that be? To actually make us a better human, or to strategically be aware of that darker side so we can cleverly use it more often?
Well, evolution made you by default unaware, and that was probably roughly in your interest, at least to the extent your modern environments are similar to the ancient environments that these habits involved in. And I actually don't think the environments have changed that much. So most likely you are better off not knowing if you're just an ordinary person in an ordinary situation. Some people, of course, may just be curious, and we are offering curiosity to the cat who can't resist and who may suffer as a result. But in addition to that, we can offer insight to people who feel like they're in unusual situations where they especially need to understand other people's behaviors and their own in terms of motives, such as, say, salespeople or managers. And then for social scientists like myself, I think it's especially important that we not be just really wrong about the very basics of the phenomena we're studying. If you are trying to create, say, education reforms and new educational institutions, and you make right from the start the wrong assumption about what education is about, what it's for, what are the main forces that shaped the schooling institutions, then your reform suggestions are likely to go wrong.
And this is a difficulty we have in economics, in that we tend not to have a kind of a structure or principles that might be laid out similar to physics, and we have to pass judgment and make decisions that could end up being wrong but perceived to be correct.
Well, I mean, everybody who matters faces the problem that they could hurt by being wrong. That's if you can't hurt anybody by being wrong, then you don't matter. You're not actually doing anything that is useful either. And all areas of science or academia that matter, not only can they make mistakes, they could make a mistake via having made an incorrect assumption and naively just making the wrong assumption. What's perhaps different about economics is that we are very interested in the topic, and so are other people, and we may well be built to be biased so that the first thing that comes to mind is just quite wrong, much more often than, say, the first thing that might come to mind when you're doing biochemistry.
So the elephant in the brain, the noun that you have to describe it is an important but unacknowledged feature of how our minds work. So with us as a human compared to an animal who may not have those motives, they do have those self-interested motives, because we do see the animal world react in certain ways that make them self-interested. But we as humans may bring it to a different level, that we could actually, because we're social beings, we could end up being somewhat, how could I say it, manipulate other people in order to achieve our own ends.
So animals don't have much of a reason to deceive themselves or other people about their motives in general. Of course, say chimpanzees have been observed. If they come across food and then some other chimpanzee comes by, they'll quickly pretend not to see any food until the other one goes away so they can go back to having exclusive access to their food. So they do sometimes deceive each other. But since they don't have norms and enforce those norms on each other based on their motives, they don't have so much of a systematic reason to misjudge their motives overall. Even so, interestingly, when humans look at what chimpanzees do, our habit of attributing motives can make us go wrong in understanding them. So, for example, when chimpanzees sit around and pick insects and other bugs out of the fur of other animals, that looks to a human like they're helping. So if we were doing that with each other, we know that we would immediately explain our behavior in terms of trying to help each other. by being useful, I'll pick out of your back and you'll pick out of mine, and we'll both help each other. And that sounds like a nice thing to do. But it turns out that the amount of time chimpanzees spend picking bugs out of each other's hair has little to do with how much need there is for that. It doesn't depend much on how many bugs are around or how big a body is in order to be picked off of, but it does depend a lot on the size of the group. And if you look at other kinds of primates, et cetera, you see an even stronger difference that they spend a lot more time when they're in bigger groups. And that suggests that what's really going on is politicking. They are forming and cementing alliances by spending time picking bugs off each other's back. And it's much less about cleaning and helping and more about showing who you feel allied with.
This book has two parts to it, Robin. And the first part, you've kind of touched on some of the aspects of why we hide our motives. You know, the main thesis is that humans are prone to self-deception about their motives. What would be the most significant evidence that you actually came across regarding human beings and why we hide our motives? Because this does have implications from, theoretical as well as actual economic behavior.
So a lot of people over the last decade or two have written books talking about how humans are self-deceived and aren't aware of things. And that's somewhat of a familiar staple now. But they usually just haven't gone from there to explaining larger social patterns and critiquing them. And that's what's more unique about our book. Once you've accepted that, yes, maybe many things people do are self-deceived, you still can probably go on thinking that all your usual stories about how society works are still true. So in order to really, make it clear to you how much you really need to change your mind, we have no substitute but having to actually go through common areas of life, and for each one of them showing you that the usual story there seems to be wrong. And so after the first of the book, where we set up the general idea of that this is plausible, we then go through 10 particular areas. And in each one of those areas, we try to show you that a very common and usual way of thinking about that is wrong. And those 10 areas are body language, laughter, charity, conversation, consumption, art, education, medicine, religion, politics. And that's a lot of big, important areas. And for each one of those areas, there's the usual story we tell each other, at least in public, about what that's for. And we claim in the book that usual story is substantially wrong. Now, of course, the world's complicated. So for every big area like charity, there are a lot of motives that are actually in play. And it's more about the distribution of these motives. Almost every conceivable motive probably happens somewhere to somebody to induce them to do charity. It's just that there's the most common motive we would point to if we were asked to explain our behavior. And then there's the most common behavior that's a motive that's actually explaining our behavior, and we say those two things are different.
And they're different in that it's more self-interest. If you're, say, charitable, you get that good feeling as you feel that you've helped some person.
Right, although the good feeling isn't really an ultimate explanation. It's just an intermediate explanation. It says that, the good feeling is saying evolution is patting you on the back and saying, good job. It doesn't say what job you're doing. So just like, laughter feels relaxing and fun, it doesn't tell you why you're laughing. It just tells you evolution has told you it wants you to do that. And so you're following along. So for charity, we say that what's more going on is trying to show each other our empathetic feelings and concern about each other. We're trying to say that, if you and I were together and you were suffering, I would feel bad about that and try to help you. I have this capacity to feel bad about people around me suffering and a tendency to respond and help. And you're trying to show that you have that capacity to the people around you through your charity. And it feels good to show that, which is why you get the warm glow. But more fundamentally, it's about showing this empathy.
How is it from other aspects that you mentioned, for example, art and, say, consumption and religion? How is it that this self-deception is actually brought in within those topics, and how they may relate to the individual, or as from a micro perspective, or even the implications it might have?
So just to be clear, in each of these areas, the structure is there's a usual story, like about art, what we do, what art is for, and then there's a bunch of puzzles that we identify and point to about things that don't make so much sense from the point of view of that basic theory. And then we identify an alternative theory. Again, it's not the only thing going on, but we think it's more than the usual story. And we show in some detail why that alternative story makes more sense of these puzzles than the usual story does. So, it's easy to just say what our claims are, but you shouldn't believe those claims unless we offer you some reason to believe those claims. And the reason is in how well they explain these puzzles. So for each of these areas, what we need to do is go through and identify the puzzles with the usual story, the things that don't make so much sense if you assume the usual story. And that's the key launching point to then understand the alternative theory.
Do you want to elaborate on any of that? Because it's slightly, I'm trying to, because I haven't read the book yet, and I just have a kind of an outline of it.
Well, so then we should pick one of these areas and go into a little more detail.
Great,
which one would you like?
I kind of like the art.
All right.
Yeah.
So our usual story about art is that it creates an experience. You listen to music, you watch a movie, you stare at painting, that there's an experience that's created in you as a result of the art, and that the reason you buy and consume the art is to enjoy that experience. And then the reason somebody else might create the art is because they enjoyed that experience or they want to help you enjoy that experience. And so the art is about the experience created by the art. Now, beauty is one of many experiences you could result in. It could be disturbing, it could be thought-provoking, etc. But it's about that experience that you create. Now, we already know, for example, there's what's called a bower bird. It's a bird that where the males create these enormous artistic structures. They aren't functional. They don't live in them, and they don't use them for food. They're just created out of special materials that are hard to find and colorful, and they are difficult to make. And the female birds look around at these sculptures, and they choose the males with the most impressive sculptures to mate with. And of course, we don't know necessarily what these birds are feeling, but plausibly it looks a lot like the way art is in our world, that the art is created by the artist as an act of being impressive. And the art consumers are impressed by the art as a way of being impressed by the artist. That is, more fundamentally, an explanation might be that what we're doing is being impressed by the artist. But you might say, well, yeah, but why should I believe that? And so that's where we need the puzzles. And one key set of puzzles about art is that we actually care about what we call extrinsic features of the art. We don't just care about the art itself and the experience it produces. We do care about how expensive were the materials used to make the art. We care about what techniques were used and how difficult they were. We care about how many artists contributed to any one piece of art. And again, none of these directly influence the experience that the art results from, but nevertheless, they show impressiveness. So, for example, long ago when we didn't have photography, having a very realistic painting was very hard, and that was very impressive. And we therefore were more impressed by and preferred art, paintings that produced very vivid, lifelike images. And then when we had photography, it was easy to create vivid, lifelike images. And then we no longer wanted those anymore. Artistic preferences switched to wanting images that were substantially different than what a photograph would show. Because that's what was harder, is to take something like a photographic image and then make something like it, but different enough that it would be hard to make something that was like that, but also interesting. And again, that's not the experience per se. The experience was the same hundreds of years ago versus today, but the relative costs of different ways of making things have changed, and therefore our preferences in art changed.
So could it be that following on from art, I know one of the other types of hidden motives is consumption. Given that there is a limitation in terms of the number of pieces that are out there due to the artist no longer being around, such as a Da Vinci, could consumption then take over in terms of you showing your own kind of conspicuous ability to purchase some of this type of piece so that to display your particular wealth?
Right. So I was talking so far about the artists themselves, their preferences to show off, and then you might ask, well, the person buying or consuming the art, what do they get out of it? So in addition to sort of identifying the more impressive artists that they might want to associate with, they could also show off their discernment, their ability to distinguish better and worse art. So just like the female bowerbirds who have a better ability to distinguish the impressive statues can then have a better advantage in choosing those mates who are impressive. Today, someone who has an improved ability to distinguish which are the more impressive pieces of art, that ability in itself is impressive to other people. And so you might, instead of creating art, which is hard to do, and making art other people see, you might rather show your distinction by the ability to figure out which is the better art. And so you might be an artistic collector who buys and shows the art, or just someone who, talks about it and has preferences over the art in a way that shows that you can better distinguish those things. And so, yes, you might, of course, just show your wealth by buying more art. But what people usually want to do is show many things in addition to their wealth. It's too easy just to show your wealth. You want to simultaneously show your wealth and other good things about you.
Just say, going back to the artist then, so their hidden motives is to, like the bowerbird perhaps, to show their abilities to the public or to an individual. Regarding the artist, you mentioned that they use certain materials or the expensive types of paper or paints. Have you spoken to artists, or have you seen evidence of that type of behavior whereby they confirm that the hidden motives are?
There's definitely a lot of that. But just to be clear, our book goes over 10 different areas. So we're not doing a lot of original research in each of these 10 areas. We are mostly taking a lot of other work on these things and summarizing them in our book. A lot of people have done work on art and on signaling in art and what art motives. And in each of these areas, a lot of people have done work in, and we're mostly just summarizing that. So instead of talking about whether I've talked to artists, it's more whether the many people have written books about these, whether they have talked to artists, and it seems pretty clear that they have.
What was the most surprising piece of research when you were going through some of these motives that actually stood out to you, or that was quite unexpected, perhaps? Because we all see, for example, maybe the body language or the laughter. Some of those types of behaviors in us would perhaps give some kind of self-deception, or perhaps deceive others in terms of how they may react or how you might want them to react.
Well, they're all pretty interesting. Laughter is surprising, I think, to me from the fact that it never much occurred to me to ask why I laughed or anybody else laughed.
Okay.
It just seems on its face to be not something that needs explaining, even though, of course, it does. And that's related to how fun just seems to be an explanation that blocks people from mentally probing further to what it comes to. People like to think they do some things for fun, and fun doesn't have any other purpose. You might work in order to make money or to show, to get a place in society, perhaps, or to find meaning, but you don't need to do fun for any other thing, because fun is its own reward. But of course, as a scientist or someone studying human behavior, that doesn't make any sense at all. Of course, fun would have to have some purpose, otherwise it wouldn't exist. But apparently it's part of our attitude toward fun that we feel like we're not doing it for any other reason. That's part of how we can feel fun when we're having fun, is that we don't think it has any other purpose, and we run to repress or even deny that we're doing it for any other purpose, because then it's work and no longer fun. Now, some of these other things, it's obvious they would need an explanation, but we just have a standard explanation that seems so obvious we don't bother to consider whether any other explanation might fit the data better. The thing that was my first entree into this area was medicine. I got a health policy postdoc in medicine and the social science of medicine immediately after I got my PhD in 1997. And then I'd been a theorist at Caltech and did a lot of math models. And then I spent the next 6 months, the first 6 months of this postdoc, learning a lot of details about medicine. And the big thing that stood out to me was how the details of medicine were just strange relative to the simple theory that theorists would talk in terms of. And so what economists are doing is what they do most everywhere, is they go to an area like medicine and they take the immediate things that everybody thinks are obvious, and then they elaborate that with more complicated math models and try to figure out subtler things, but they usually don't question the very basic assumptions that people would make about the field. So in medicine, the usual story we all tell is that, we're usually well, but sometimes we get sick. And when we get sick, there are doctors out there who can help us, but they're expensive, so we might need insurance to pay for them, and it can be hard for us to evaluate the quality of what they do, so we might need some sort of institution to evaluate that or regulate it. And that's the usual story about medicine. And economists who study medicine think that's so obvious that they don't even bother to test any of those things. They just go on to analyze the rest of the details. But in this health policy postdoc, I was struck by the fact that the big obvious details about medicine were puzzling from this very basic point of view. So, for example, one of the biggest, most obvious puzzles in medicine is that there's actually very little correlation between medicine and health. If you measure medicine by the amount people spend on medicine, or even the number of procedures they get, or the number of times they visit the doctor, etc., then people who get more medicine are on average just not healthier. And we know that from geographic variation. We also know it from randomized experiments. And that's just really puzzling from the usual point of view, that the point of medicine is to get you healthier. If more medicine doesn't make you healthier, what's the point of medicine?
So this is, again, something that we have in terms of your self-deception, or your, is this what you mean by self-deception? Another example whereby we see what might test a correlation between medicine and health, and there's no correlation at all, but initially we are believing that particular, I suppose, hypothesis that would actually happen.
Well, we are wrong. Now, why we are wrong is a more complicated thing, and who's causing us to be wrong. So perhaps the phrase self-deception suggests that you initiated the process that made you wrong, and somehow initially you weren't wrong, but then you made yourself become wrong. Whereas there are many possible ways you could end up being wrong. If they're motivated, they might be because of some fundamental causes, and that the main important thing is to understand what are these causes that are making you wrong. Why are you wrong? Why don't you know? So most of the real motives that we talk about in the book are motives that make sense to have. They aren't crazy, irrational motives. So the puzzle then is, well, why don't we know? And our explanation, as I indicated, is that a lot of the social norms that we follow in society are in terms of motives, and therefore we have this habit of trying to attribute the best possible motives to ourselves. And that habit is so strong that we don't even notice how plausible the motives are in terms of our best evidence. We mainly ask that they be at least on the surface plausible, and as long as they seem to roughly be plausible and they make us look good, then we stop there. We don't analyze more deeply. We talk in the book about split brain experiments from 50 years ago, and how that shows that people are really in the habit of just making up explanations they're very confident in without thinking about it very much. So when people are split in the sense that their two halves of their brain are disconnected, then each half talks to a particular arm and leg and eye and ear, and you can separate these different parts of the person in terms of putting up blocks so that you can talk to one half of the brain and get responses, and the other half doesn't see it at all. And that's what a split brain experiment is. So you can talk to one half of the brain and say, stand up, and then it will use the leg it controls to start pushing up, and then the other leg will go along. And then you can ask the other side of the brain, why are you getting up? And of course, it doesn't know. Literally, it's disconnected from the other half of its brain. And that would, of course, be the honest answer, is it has no idea what happened to the other half of its brain. But that's not what it does. It typically makes a confident, plausible explanation, like, I wanted to get a Coke. And once it's made that explanation, it feels like it knows the answer. It isn't searching for an explanation. It isn't doubting and wondering what the evidence for that is. It just says it. And that is the human habit for our motives. So, in some sense, the conscious part of your mind is like the press secretary or for the president. The press secretary doesn't actually know why the president does things. Nevertheless, when there's a press conference, it's the press secretary who stands up there and when asked a question about why the president does something, gives an answer. And that answer isn't known to be correct. Sometimes they feel like they do a better job if they don't know why the president really did something. But their job is to make it plausible and to be confident about it. And that's what your conscious mind does with your behaviors. It explains them. And so you're just built consciously to look at what you're doing and constantly make up plausible explanations that make you look good, like the press secretary would. And that's why you really have not that much of an idea what's really going on. And so to figure out what's really going on, we're going to have to dig into the details of the behavior to see which better fits your actual behavior.
Say, for example, if we're talking to, or if we're listening to an interview being done between, say, a journalist and an economic or stock market analyst, and they're asking certain questions, should we be pretty much doubting, or should we be doubting their answers to be somewhat plausible?
Well,
because sometimes, or usually, these analysts can get it wrong.
Well, again, it depends on what you're asking them about. So our book is about the elephant in the brain, which is motives, hidden motives. So when you ask people about their motives, that's an especially, place you should be skeptical and doubt people's motives. You don't necessarily have to doubt what conscious feeling they have. They might well have said the sentence in their head, I think I want to do this because of X. And that might be what they said to themselves just before and after they did it. And so that, in a sense, might be the story they're telling themselves about why they did it. But you should doubt whether that's really why they did it.
So, some elements of this kind of remind me of George Soros' theory of reflexivity. When he looks at the human, almost like the human mind is broken up into cognitive motives and a manipulative motive. And we being humans, we're thinking beings, so we do have the cognitive motive, but we differ to other species in that we can manipulate that type of thinking process, and whether our understanding of a certain situation, I don't know whether it's particular motives or not, but if we interpret it correctly and we move away from what's actually real, we tend to create situations like a bubble. And that brings about, say, a positive feedback loop, in that we are mistakenly believing a particular situation by manipulating, perhaps based on some human or behavioral heuristics like overconfidence or kind of like a herding mentality when other people are actually, say, boosting a particular financial asset. And it's only when we realize that realize the truth, we end up with a negative feedback loop, in that once something is confirmed to be real, we have pretty much moved away from a certain level, such as, I don't want to be using the word equilibrium, but if we have moved away from a certain state by a large degree, we end up with, say, for example, a crash. I know that's not what you're discussing in this particular book, like bubbles and crashes and that, but would that resonate somewhat with the book that you've written, The Elephant in the Room?
Yeah. So our basic thesis that people are often wrong about their motives is just a very old observation about human behavior. And of course, it's been said by not only psychologists and sociologists and other thoughtful observers of the human condition and people who write novels for a very long time. It's just that most of that critique hasn't gone to talking about the institutions we're in and the critiquing our policies about them. So you might in a novel notice that a character went to school for a reason other than the motive they thought they had. That might be something a character discovers about themselves in the course of a self-discovery novel, but it wouldn't be thought to critique the educational institutions and policies that we have. People usually just don't make those connections. And when people do go talking about educational policy, they usually set aside all the possibility of being wrong about the motives and just talk about the usual thing. So the vast majority of papers and books on education policy assume that education is about learning the material, that that's what it's for, and reform should be targeted to do that, to learn better material, to learn it faster, to have the right people learn the material, to do it cheaply. Those are all things that education policy talks about. Education policy doesn't almost always talk about whether it really is about learning the material. What if education is just about something else? What would that mean about how we should structure education, or whether we should subsidize it or tax it? And that's where we go more in our book. We more make the connections between the fact that we're all deceived about things and these larger social institutions that we're embedded in, and how we should treat those institutions.
Robin, how have you been keeping since I was last speaking to you? It's been over a year, yeah.
Busy. It's been busy. So the first book the last book was my first book. And so I'm trying to support as much publicity as I could, doing media interviews and giving talks. I gave well over 100 talks on it. And Now I've got the second book coming out here, and I'm trying to prepare for hopefully interest and attention to try to do what I can for that. And of course, I have another life. I moved house 6 months ago, and I've got a grant that I'm supposed to be working on, and many other interesting things have come up. The crypto world exploded, and since I do prediction markets, and a lot of the crypto companies want to do prediction markets, and I've got a lot of interest in people wanting to be on the boards of advisors and advise projects, and that's all great, of course, but it's coming at this time. I already decided ahead of time I was going to focus on my second book, so running out of time.
How was it with that explosion in cryptocurrencies? Are there mainly ICOs, companies resorting to ICOs that are in touch with you regarding the prediction models?
Well, as you know, in the crypto world, ICOs are the main revenue source for these crypto companies. They're mainly, putting up new coins for investors to buy, and they get a big pile of money, and then they can sit on that money for a few years while they develop software and supposedly produce the product that will justify that investment. And so there's a huge world of people basically writing white papers and throwing up coin auctions, because apparently a lot of people will invest a lot in a company based only on a white paper. Yeah. And there's a bit of a bubble, I'd have to say. And that
I wouldn't touch an ICO, I don't think, to be honest.
Right. Well, certainly not now. So almost everything that has some value can be either over or underpriced. The fact that it's overpriced doesn't mean it has zero value. It just means the price is too high relative to the value. So I certainly think crypto coins are exciting and have some long-term promise, and they ought to be worked on some, and some of them will turn out to be valuable. But even if that's true, the prices can be too high. And that means when the price is too high on something that's valuable, you should sell. That doesn't mean the value is zero. It just means the value is less than the price.
How do you know if it's not valuable? How would you know it's overpriced? Is it that people's behavior?
Well, of course,
the markets, or?
You could say, the price is anything anybody wants it to be, and gold is valuable only because people want gold, and therefore the price could be anything. And some people have said that sort of thing. But I feel like I should tie my estimate of value more to revenue that these companies could achieve. If they're producing a product that somebody's using, how many users could there be, and how much plausibly could those people pay, and how fast could that grow? And then I've got to estimate those things in order to estimate the value of the company. Yeah. You have to have a present value of the plausible revenue minus the cost they'd be spending. And when I make those estimates, the values just look too high.
Have you looked at any prediction models or read up on any work regarding other coins like the Bitcoin or Litecoin or Ethereum, things that are not associated with ICOs?
Well, again, the main thing is to look for revenue. So unfortunately, I was invited to do various crypto conferences many years ago, well before all these prices went up. And when I went to these conferences, people would talk about developing applications and products that could produce revenue. And unfortunately, what would happen is that each new conference would have a different set of companies that were pointed out as the ones they would hope would produce revenue. And even now, several years later, none of them are producing revenue. So almost all the revenue that people have in mind is all speculative revenue they hope to have later, even after many years here of companies starting up and trying to pursue revenue and then not apparently doing that. So that looks bad. Doesn't mean they won't find revenue, some of them at least, but honestly, it looks tough. And of course, I also know about some technical details wherein Bitcoin and Ethereum and other ones have trouble scaling up to a lot of users and a lot of transactions, and have trouble adding features. And of course, there are always these new coins that supposedly solve the problem of those initial features. But the question is, which coin will have enough features altogether to really make it work? And probably somebody will, but investing in all the companies, all the coins all at once probably isn't a good way to try to get to that value. You'd have to have inside information about which ones actually look like they have the chance of doing it.
How's life at George Mason?
Well, I love being a tenured professor. It's a great deal. It's a great deal. And it's a remarkable deal relative to other professions, in the sense that in most jobs, as you get more senior, you'll get more respect and more discretion and more ability to choose what you work on and with who and when and where. You'll have more choice, but it'll be a limited range of more choice. You'll still have to do roughly the same job or manage roughly the same job, although you could, again, have more freedom and discretion. But as a professor, once you get tenure, I mean, you'll still have to teach perhaps and show up for class, but for your research, you really have enormous discretion. You can study whatever you want in whatever area you want, at whatever pace you want, with whatever research priorities you want. If you need money to help you do that research, well, then you'll need to apply for funding, and then you'll be limited by what it takes to tell the funders to convince you to give them money. But if you can do research that doesn't really require money, like the theory that I like to do, then you're free. And so that's just great for me. And it's remarkable to me that, of course, a lot of people do pursue academic careers in the hope of getting such freedom, but the vast majority of people who get such freedom don't actually use it to pursue risky intellectual projects. They mostly continue doing the sort of intellectual work they did before they got tenure. They might do it at a slower pace, a little more relaxed, but they don't usually venture out to try whole new things that they'd have the freedom to do that they couldn't do before they had tenure.
I was just going to ask you something there. It's gone from me.
Well, of course, our book has a theory of conversation, and that extends to a theory of the news media and academia. So plausibly, the news media and academia are both sort of more specialized conversations, but that they inherit the basic structure of our motives in conversation. And so in conversation, the usual theory is that we're sharing information.
Yeah.
So I talk to you, you talk to me. When I'm talking to you and you're listening, I'm giving you information. And then when I shut up and listen to you, now you're giving me information. And so the simplest theory of conversation is sharing information. And that, of course, is very pro-social. Who could argue with the social value of people sharing information? And that's a nice theory we like to explain our behavior with, is that we want to share information. But that theory has a bunch of puzzles that don't make sense from the point of view of sharing information. If we were trading information, then we should be more eager to listen than to talk, and we are in fact the opposite. We should be keeping track of debts. We could say, well, I told you 3 things and you've only told me 1 thing, and the thing you told me isn't very important, so you need to tell me some more things. And we, of course, focus on talking about the most important things, because those would be the things that gave us the most valuable information. And these are not good descriptions of conversations. We, in fact, are more eager to talk than to listen. We talk about relatively unimportant things. We don't keep track of who's said how much. So what's going on with conversation? And so we suggest that conversation is more about showing off. And you're showing off a mental backpack of skills and resources. So there's this norm in conversation that in small talk say that the conversation should just drift continuously. The next thing each person says should relate mildly, at least, and a lot to the last person something says, right? And we shouldn't just switch topics wholesale. And then even though what we're saying isn't very important necessarily, it's at least staying with the conversation. So in a conversation like that, you can show off by showing that wherever the conversation goes, because you're not in control usually of where the conversation goes if there's more, several people involved, still you can pull something out of your backpack that's relevant and impressive. You have an anecdote, you have a friend, you have a fact that's relevant to that particular thing. And so that's a test of your generality and the strength of your backpack, because if you're my friend, you'll get access to that whole backpack. Whenever you've got a problem, I will be able to use my backpack of mental tools and resources to apply it to your problem. And so I'm passing this test of showing that I've got a big pack and it can do a lot. And now you can be impressed by that, and this explains many of these puzzling things. I don't mind that you haven't given me information. You've let me show off my backpack, and I like that. And I'm happy to be eager to talk, and I'm okay with this test of drifting across random topics that aren't very important, because, again, I'm showing off my backpack. Now, that's ordinary conversation, but plausibly the news media and academic research are the same sort of conversation, though a bit more specialized. So in the news media, there's also a big priority on people talking about the news that's the news of the hour, the current news topic everybody else is talking about. And it's not usually the most important things we should talk about, but we're really eager to have something to say about whatever the news is that everybody else is talking about. And we're really eager to talk about it more than we are to listen. And that's also true of the news media themselves, but we ourselves, we want to track the news and be able to talk knowledgeably about the current news of the day with our friends and associates and show that we're not out of touch with the important things that everybody else is talking about, even though they're not actually very important. And the same in academic research, plausibly. When a journal looks at a submitted paper to decide whether to publish it. They send it to referees who then primarily look at how impressive it is. They don't do much evaluation of how important it is or how valuable to the world it is. They just ask how impressive it is. And that's usually in terms of how difficult were the tools, or how difficult was it to collect the data, or how subtle an analysis you did. And it's enough to get published as long as you show that you did something difficult, even if it's not very socially valuable. And if the paper says something that is very socially valuable, but it seems to use very simple tools and intellectual approach, it will typically be rejected as not impressive enough.
And that can be unfortunate.
Well, yes, from the point of view of helping the world with innovation, that's unfortunate because it's just not directed at that task.
Yeah.
And I, as an academic, live in that world. So that means I'm held by other academics to the standard of being impressive. But with tenure, I can ignore that and just go do what I think is important. And when I go do that, I don't actually have that much competition. Well, if I just use simple methods and simple tools to make what seem to me important observations and insights, other people have mostly left that waiting for me to work on.
And something that interests you as well, to help you get through the work that you do. And not just having to do some research in order to impress the peers.
But most academics, that doesn't seem to be much of a priority. Otherwise, there'd be a lot more of them doing these interesting things. So what I think is interesting is, in some sense, whether it's important, simple metrics of how much it could matter to the world. But for most academics, that's not their criteria of interesting. Usually they're able to adjust their criteria of interesting to stick close to what they've been doing to do impressive publications, and they mostly think that their impressive publications are interesting. That's their concept of interesting, is the things that have gotten them attention and prestige. And big important subjects that are important to the world are often not interesting to them, or often they're even stay away from. So there are big topics like, say, sex or UFOs, where ordinary people are interested in them, and academics were traditionally uninterested in them exactly because ordinary people were interested. Until the academics could find a way to distinguish themselves on those topics, to do it in a way that clearly signaled that they were not ordinary people talking about them. They were special creatures who had a different approach. They just stayed away from the topics of most interest to ordinary people.
Robin, when is your book is released at the moment on Kindle, and then it's going on general release?
On January 2nd. You can also get it now on Google Play. And so we're in an unusual situation where it's available to most everybody before the official burst of publicity will happen about it. And so if your readers hear this before that date, they could go read it and write a review that would come out at the same time as the big shots official reviews. They could be treated equally that way, whereas usually it's the insiders who get a copy of the book before everybody else, and you have to read their review before you can decide what you think. And by the time you tell everybody what you think, everybody's already heard what the big shots think, and they don't care what you think.
So that's the elephant in the brain, hidden motives in everyday life.
That's it.
Robin, it's been fantastic to catch up and speak to you again. You hit what we call a hat trick here. Three episodes in the 123 now that have been released. So I'm very excited to read this book and delve more into it and understand it a bit more after our conversation.
I'm honored to be your first post-hiatus podcast here.
Yes, that's it. Yeah, back in the running now, I think. Robin, again, thank you so much for being so inspiring and for joining me on Economic Rockstar. Again, I had a blast and I personally learned a lot from you. Share again with our listeners where they could find you.
I am Robin Hanson at George Mason University. I have a general website, hanson.gmu.edu. There's a website for the book, elephantinthebrain.com, a website for my previous book, ageofm.com, and I have a blog, overcomingbias.com, and I, on Twitter, easy to find.
And you can find all the links to Robin on economicrockstar.com/Robin Hanson 3. Robin, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. You are an economic rock star.
Thank you. Take care.
As always.
Take care.
Can I ask you one more
question,
of course. Robin? I meant to ask any developments on the cryogenetically being frozen, no? Any updates?
No. Again, that's more of a data point for me. My world that I see is full of puzzles, and that's a puzzle. I'm one of the few cryonics customers. And there are very few others, and the industry that supplies them is limited by the fact there are so few customers. So even though there's a lot of medical technology that could be developed and applied, since there are so few customers, there's relatively little incentive to do that. So then we have to pause and wonder why there are so few customers for this apparent product. So, I ask people what they think the chance of it working is, and their opinions vary, but at least 10% of people seem to think the chance is high enough that doing the calculations, it would be worth it for them. But of course, out of 7 billion people, only 2,000 have really signed up as customers, and only 200 have actually used the product in terms of being frozen. So there's a big disconnect there between the fraction of people who, given their statements and beliefs, would seem to want to buy it, and the fraction who actually do. And that's exactly that kind of puzzle that I'm always going through in the elephant in the brain, looking for disconnects between our simple theories of ourselves and what we actually do.
Fantastic. I'll keep an eye out anyway, Robin, and I'll talk to you soon.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye. If you enjoyed this podcast, why not leave some feedback or comments on the show notes page on economicrockstar.com, where you can also sign up and be a member of the Economic Rockstar community. If you're listening to this episode on iTunes or Stitcher Radio, I would love to have some feedback and for you to leave an honest rating and review, as this will help with the rankings of the show so that more people can find it. If you're listening on the website economicrockstar.com, make sure you check out the back catalogue of all previous episodes and interviews with some amazing professors and authors at economicrockstar.com/podcasts. Thanks for listening, and I really appreciate your loyal support. I know how much you love audio, so why not get a free audiobook with Economic Rockstar today? I've teamed up with audiobooks.com to bring you this amazing offer. Visit audiobooks.com/rockstar to download your free audiobook now.